Good morning. Let's call this regular board meeting to order. Please join me with a salute to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Here.
Mr. Harrington?
Here.
Mr. Maryhill?
Here.
Mr. Gardner?
Here.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Here.
Mr. Blades?
Here.
Mr. McNally?
Here.
Mr. Skazbava?
Here.
Mr. Cannon has been excused. Mr. Pleedy?
Here.
Mr. Moore? Mr. Murnell?
Here.
Mr. Whitson? Mr. Grinnell?
Here.
Mr. Connell?
Here.
Mr. Gorland?
Here.
And Mr. Preston?
Here.
Thank you.
We have no guests registered to speak. However, before we move into resolutions, I would like to make one recognition, please. Ms. Garrison. We'd like to recognize Judy Garrison, an award of appreciation for 25 years with the county. So, he knows how to get them off their feet.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for your service. Okay, we'll move into resolutions.
Resolution number 194, authorizing budget amendments for various departments.
Moved by Mrs. Skazbava. Second, Mr. Morrow. Comments or questions? If not, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skazbava?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon has been excused. Mr. Pleedy?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Murnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 195, authorizing appointments to boards, committees, and/or councils.
Moved by Mr. Blades. I have a second. Mr. Grinnell. Mr. Marnell. Comments or questions? Seeing none, all in favor, aye? Aye. Opposed? Carried.
Resolution number 196, adopting and approving quality improvement reviews and policies procedures for the Certified Home Health Agency and preventive services approved by the PAC.
Moved by Mr. Connell. I have a second. Mr. Blades. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skazbava?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Pleedy?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Murnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution number 197, authorizing the hiring of 4 per diem dispatchers in emergency services E911.
Moved by Mr. Gorland, second by Mr. Morrow, Mr. Gardner. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skazbava?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Pleedy?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Murnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries.
Mr. Chair,
Yes,
can I ask a question on that previous resolution? The 12, when we went from the 8 to 12 hours, how much of an impact is that having with the need for more dispatchers? Is that created a void, in other words, by having them there 4 days versus?
No, we never changed the dispatchers. The dispatchers have all been set up. The way it was originally set up when we started the dispatching was different than what we had set up with the jail, the correction officers and the deputies. Under the dispatchers, they were limited to 80 hours within a 2-week period, so there would be no overtime, additional overtime in that period. What it works out is there's I think 6 days of 12 hours and 1 day of 8. So that schedule never has altered since we started with them. And I don't think typically on a 12-hour shift, there's less time to cover if you have 12-hour shifts as opposed to 8. If you have 8-hour shifts, then you have to have 3 people cover that shift, whereas if you have 12 hours, you only need 2 to cover a 24-hour day. So I think the way it's set up is probably working. It's really been driven by medical leaves and family and medical leaves and some of those things that are what's driving the train as far as needing additional people. And I have to tell you that honestly, this per diem list, it will be difficult to find to even fill that list. Like I said to you when we first started talking about this, we may have to come back and revisit this on a part-time basis as opposed to a per diem list, but ultimately establishing a per diem list without benefits is the cheapest way to proceed.
Okay, thank you.
Resolution number 198, authorizing the Essex County Emergency Services Department to apply for and accept a grant from the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services FY 2015 Unified Hazard Mitigation Program.
Moved by Mr. Woodson, second by Mr. Moore. Comments or questions? None? Roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee? Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Paliti?
Yes.
Mr. Moore? Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 199, authorizing changes to the probation department based upon recommendations of the salary subcommittee and authorizing an increase in hours from 37.5 to 40 hours per week in the probation department, and further authorizing the promotion of 1 grade step for all probation officers in the department.
Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Moore. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Paliti?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution number 200, authorizing the county chairman or county manager to execute letters of authorization for the engineering design necessary for the construction project of a handicap bathroom at the Cornell Cooperative Extension Building in an amount not to exceed $33,000, which monies are to come from budgeted funds.
Moved by Mr. Harrington, second by Mr. Moore. Comments or questions?
We actually need to amend this. These are not budgeted funds from the county. These are actually the building fund that Cornell Cooperative Extension raised on their own. There's $33,000 that Cornell raised. We will be using that to start. The cost of the LOA won't be $33,000. It'll probably be $2,000 or $3,000, but we will start spending the $33,000 for Cornell. And then if we need more, we'll come back. But at this point, it would be from funds raised by Cornell Cooperative Extension in the amount of $33,000.
Any comments or questions, Tom?
Dan, are we doing the work in-house, or are we going to bid?
We'll probably go to bid, Tom, at this point.
So $33,000 will cover materials, prevailing wages and everything? I mean,
I can't say that for certain. That's why I've said to you,
Right.
if we need to, we'll see that once we get some bid documents and go out.
okay.
We will do what work we can in-house. I've talked to Chris about this. If we have to, we've got to dig a line quite a ways to get to the town's water and sewer connection. So, we'll do those kinds of things as best we can. But
then is it some money coming from Cornell?
Cornell had a building fund.
With them?
We'll need some kind of agreement.
We'll tack that on there.
Okay. Yeah. And we'll, Cornell has raised this fund for the intent to make improvements to the building, so Dan will have to do some kind of an agreement as part of this resolution.
You have a comment or question? Charlie?
I realize that the extension building does need handicap accommodations, but the whole building is in a sad state, and there isn't a room or any area whatsoever that you can look at that doesn't need repair.
Okay, all in favor of the amendment? Aye. Opposed? Now the resolution as amended, need a roll call vote on that.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore? Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
Resolution carries as amended. Resolution 201, authorizing the issuance of a permit allowing the use of county roadways for the Adirondack Marathon Distant Festival to be held in Spoon Lake on September 26th and 27th, 2015.
Moved by Mr. Marnell, second by Mr. Moore. Comments or questions? All in favor, aye? Aye. Opposed? Carried.
Resolution 202, authorizing the execution by the county chairman or county manager of letters of authorization for the development of bid documents for the design of the retaining walls of the transfer stations in the towns of Mariah, Scroon, and Keene at a total cost of $9,000, with such funds to be covered by the Essex County and to come from budgeted funds.
Moved by Mr. Skozavala, second by Mr. Marnell. Comments or questions? Roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Abstain.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 203, authorizing the purchasing agent to award the bid to General Roofing Contractors, LLC, for repairs of the Government Center Roof Replacement Project, Phase 2, for the County Complex Roof, Bell Tower, and Mental Health Building Roof, in the amount of $277,880, with additional funds up to $77,880 to come from unappropriated fund balance, and further authorizing the chairman or county manager to execute contract documents.
Moved by Mr. Grinnell, second. Mr. Marnell. Comments or questions? Being none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 204, accepting, adopting, and placing on file policies, plans, procedures, and annual reports.
Moved by Mr. Blades. Second, Mr. Skozavala. Comments or questions? Being none, all in favor, aye? Aye. Opposed? Carried.
Resolution 205, setting the date for a public hearing on the proposed 2015-16 North Country Community College budget to be held on August 3rd, 2015 at 9:30 a.m.
Moved by Mr. Politi. Second. Mr. Moore. Comments or questions?
I'm going to have to oppose this.
The record should reflect that due notice was given throughout our official newspapers of this public hearing. This resolution's a little late, but the process was done correctly, so I just want to recite that for the record, that all processes involved with respect to notice were done timely.
All in favor, aye? Aye. Opposed? Carried.
Resolution 206, to cancel penalties in the amount of $72.98 plus any accrued interest at time of payment with respect to property in the town of Chesterfield, bearing tax map number 4.53-3-23.000.
Moved by Mr. Morrow. For a second, Mr. Brunel. Comments or questions? Mr. Morrow.
I don't think that's the right amount. If I remember right talking to Mike, it was $149. Can I move an amendment to make it up to $149? I think that's what it's supposed to be, just in case it is.
Why wouldn't you put it in?
Pass it at 72.
Right, let's put it in the present amount.
What's that, Dan?
Cancel penalties in the present amount?
Yes, please.
All in favor of the amendment? Aye. On the resolution as amended, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington? Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee? Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Paliti? Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 207, authorizing real property tax services to amend the subdivision map fee schedule.
Moved by Mr. Skozavala, second. Mr. Brunel, Mr. Maryhill. Comments or questions? Roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington? Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Paliti?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 208, authorizing real property tax services to amend the real property tax service fee schedule, increasing the amount from 50 cents to 55 cents.
Moved by Mr. Maryhill, second Mr. Skozavala, Mr. Moore. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington? Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Paliti?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. Resolution 209, authorizing the purchasing agent to award bid to Optect Environmental Services in the amount of $12,577 for mold removal at the Nutrition Building, and further authorizing the county chairman or county manager to execute a contract in this regard, which monies are to come from budgeted funds.
Moved by Mr. Moore, second. Mr. Grinnell. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington? Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Paliti?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution 210, of condolence to the family of Lisa M. Pulsifer, come.
Moved by Mr. Gardner. Thank you.
Resolutions from the floor. Authorizing the payment of $80 to Andrea L. Wright and $6,300 to David W. Franklin relative to the acquisition of property located in the town of Mariah, Essex County, New York, for the Ensign Pond Road over Millbrook project, bearing PIN numbers 1759.50, and further authorizing the county chairman or county manager to execute all purchase agreements and other documents necessary to effectuate the purchase.
Clerk call the law on the floor.
Yes, you do.
Moved by Mr. Skozavala, second. Mr. Grinnell. Comments or questions? Mr. Skozavala.
Yeah, this is the first I was aware of it. Were they both willing, both parties willing sellers? There was no...
I think so.
Yeah.
What's that?
Should be, yeah.
We need roll call, yeah.
Okay. Roll call vote, please.
Somebody want to explain it?
Sorry.
I can briefly explain it from what I'm, this is the Ensign Pond Road over Millbrook project.
Dan, I can't hear you.
I'm sorry,
Thank you.
this is the Ensign Road over Millbrook Road project. I believe it's a bridge project, is it not, Chris? And in order to do these bridges, we need to acquire interest in property to put the bridge there or to put the abutments. And in this instance, we've got to pay $800 to a property owner, Andrea Wright, and $6,300 to Donald Franklin.
Any further questions? Mr. Mayor?
Just curious as where that money will be budgeted from.
Comes out of the budget, the bridge fund. Right.
Thank you.
Further, Mr. Scott?
Did we get FEMA money for this project also, I believe?
I'm not sure this one is a FEMA project.
Federal aid?
Federal aid, yeah.
Any further comment or question? Not, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
Resolution carries. The next one from the floor is seeking an enumeration of all railroad crossings on state, county, and local roadways and other thoroughfares from New York State Department of Transportation, Essex County Department of Public Works, and the Highway Public Works Department of various towns in order to protect the general health, welfare, and safety of the traveling public.
12 on the floor.
Yes, you do.
Moved by Mr. Grinnell. Second. Mr. Harrington. Comments or questions? Seeing none, all in favor, aye? Aye. Opposed? Carried.
Resolution authorizing the chairman or county manager to execute an amendment to the supplemental agreement between the New York State Department of Transportation and the Essex County Department of Public Works for a state Marchicelli Program Aid eligible transportation federal aid project.
12 to 11 on the floor.
Yes, you do.
Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Skozavala, Mr. Marnell. Comments or questions? None, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
The resolution carries. Resolution approving the 2015-2016 North Country Community College operating budget in the amount of $13,764,188, authorizing the appropriation of $1,240,000 in the 2016 Essex County budget as Essex County sponsor share.
12 to 11 on the floor.
Yes, you do.
By Mr. Grinnell, second by Mr. Pleady. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot?
Yes.
Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Pleady?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gorland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
The resolution carries. I'm not sure about the last one.
We have one more.
Yeah, authorizing, it's on the Ray Bridge in Keene for the FEMA project. Is it authorizing the project? I'm not exactly sure what the resolution is.
This is a FEMA bridge project, the Dr. Ray Bridge in Keene. Because the original PW was written for construction costs of $476,835, the actual bridge price came in at $715,000. So just to keep ourselves out of trouble with FEMA, I'm looking for a resolution authorizing this as a FEMA project. The cost is covered by FEMA. We've had discussions with FEMA. They are willing to pay it, but I just want a resolution on the record that the board was aware that the cost went up that much. So that's really what I'm looking for, a resolution authorizing the FEMA project in the amount of $715,000 for the Dr. Ray Bridge in Keene, FEMA project PW 04229.
The 12 allow that on the floor?
Yes, you do.
Move that myself. Second, Mr. Morrow. Any other comments or questions? None? Do we need roll call on that?
Yeah.
We're not actually, roll call.
Mr. Morrow has a
Mr. Morrow,
question.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, to go on, to expand a little bit on what Dan said, as we all know, when FEMA comes through and writes their PWs up, they're only an estimate. When you go out to bid, they will fully cover the amount, as long as you're gone out to bid, which we did, so there's no problem there.
Anything else? Anyone else? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill?
Yes.
Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skozavala?
Yes.
Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Palooty?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mr. Marnell?
Yes.
Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell?
Yes.
Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston.
Yes.
The resolution carries. That's all I have.
Any further resolutions from the floor? Mr. Connell.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I hesitate to bring this up because you always accuse me of being old and having memory problems, but I thought at Ways and Means we had a resolution on the cap between E-Town and Westport and the county on some money that was coming in for the reassessment aid.
Yeah, it was one, right.
Is it under,
Was it grouped in with all the others?
I think so.
It's,
Well, then the chairman's right.
I don't remember that.
Well, you can vote no, and you're going to cost the county money.
I would never vote no, Dan, against you.
It's under resolution, the first resolution, under the, from the Finance Committee.
Okay, thank you.
Any other resolutions come from the floor? None? Any further business? Mr. Glow?
A couple of questions. The first one is, on the RFP for solar park at the landfill, that's, you know where that is?
Yeah, I can, we had, kind of put that on hold because the numbers that we received from the companies that bid, made an assumption that our rate was going to grow at 4% a year for every year of the 20 years. It was an unrealistic number, really, from my point of view and from Linda's point of view. So we kind of put that thing on hold, and during the course of that period, the date which the bids were based upon as far as NYSERDA's program has changed. Number of companies that got a hold of us afterwards indicated that they felt that the new regulations under NYSERDA would be more favorable for us. So at this point, I still haven't gotten back. I think we will go back out for this project, but under the new rules, which I hope are more favorable. Additionally, any savings that's projected will have to be based upon our current agreement with Mega at the 6 cents a kilowatt. Truthfully, they were basing our savings on paying 10 cents a kilowatt with a 4% per year growth rate, and that was an unrealistic number.
Second question, Dan, on the county home cemetery.
County Home Cemetery, I need to speak, and I apologize, I should have done this last week, but I've had a couple trials in between, and I need to speak with the property owner just to nail down one point, and then I've got to convey that information to the surveyor. He's pretty much done, he just needs to put that in there, then he'll get it to me. I have the applications ready for APA and for the planning board, then that'll all be submitted. And then, so you probably won't be until the end of September until we get final approval, because it'll take 2 planning board meetings. And, I've been a little bit behind on that, but I've got to get in touch with that property owner. So this is...
Thank you.
Any further questions? Any further business to come before this board? Mr. Scott, the file.
Saw some of these.
The right one.
Some of the emails on the generator issue, Dan, where are we on that?
We have a Caterpillar representative coming up tomorrow morning to, what I didn't realize at the time was that, and I don't know if Chris did or not, but there are logs which are contained within the Caterpillar generator itself, which are proprietary, can only be read by a Caterpillar representative, and so we did contact a Caterpillar. They do have an individual, Mike Varnell helped us locate someone to come up. So we have an individual coming tomorrow morning to read the logs on the generator itself. We had installed the data logger on the Square D switching. That data logging appeared to show that it was doing the correct switchover in terms of those switches, so the problem is somewhere else. We hope to get something out of this on tomorrow to see if it's within the generator itself or if it's a problem in wiring or something else.
Mr. Gurnall? Who was the professional designer of this system?
Crandall Associates was the architects that designed the whole building. I'm not sure who they used as electrical engineer. I don't know if they did it themselves or not. I wasn't involved at that time.
Are they aware?
Crandall Associates is out of business.
They weren't very good.
Anything else, Mr. Gurnall? Can't believe you're lost for
I was thinking, it's when they drop off.
I just have a couple of things. One thing just popped into my mind relative to 2 weeks ago for the Ironman and the fire at the Ironman. I think a phenomenal job was done with respect to fighting that fire and allowing the Ironman event to go on, especially since those buildings are right on the shoreline, and all the debris and water that that did leak into the lake. From what I understand, the fire and the whole process didn't end until just briefly before the swim was supposed to occur. And whoever took place or was involved in marshaling the various assets to ensure that the Ironman went on, that was incredible. When you think of what could have happened, from the obtaining of the buoys and making sure everything was going to come off correctly, I think kudos should go to Supervisor Politi, probably Supervisor Preston, who's involved, Don Jaquish, and anybody else who I may have left out, but I think, just in my mind, that's an incredible feat to be able to pull that off.
What is this here?
That's not a resolution, that's just an observation by me. Second thing is I'd like to go into a brief executive session relative to possible litigation against Bass Hatfield and to try to resolve a contractual issue with further advices from me. It won't take long.
Move that. I'll move the session. Mr. Moore, Mary Hugh, second by Mr. Gardner.
And I'd ask that Chris Garrow and Kurt Bassarat join us in the executive session.
Okay, we're 10:55, we're back in regular session. During executive session, no decisions were made. With that,
I would like to ask for a resolution authorizing myself and Chris Garrow to negotiate with Bass Hatfield relative to the current differences we have with respect to the Grove Bridge project located in Osceola Forks. That's the substance of the resolution.
but 12 will allow that on the floor.
Yes,
I will move.
you do.
Okay. Moved by Mr. Morrow, second by Mr. Mary Hugh. Comments or questions? Seeing none, roll call vote.
Mr. Morrow?
Yes.
Mr. Harrington?
Yes.
Mr. Maryhill? Yes. Mr. Gardner?
Yes.
Mr. Depot? Yes. Mr. Farabee?
Yes.
Mr. Blades?
Yes.
Mr. McNally?
Yes.
Mr. Skoslava? Mr. Cannon is excused. Mr. Palooty? Mr. Moore? Mr. Marnell? Mr. Whitson?
Yes.
Mr. Grinnell? Mr. Connell?
Yes.
Mr. Gilliland?
Yes.
And Mr. Preston?
Yes.
The resolution carries.
Any further business to come before the board? Not, stand there. Oh, wait a minute. Somebody, Chris has got, Chris, I'm sorry. Chris on the floor. Chris, you have the floor.
I met Chris, man. Good courtesy of the floor.
Somebody move that display, 12 allowed on the floor.
Who seconded it? Mauro?
I just wanted to make the board aware that Kirk Passrab will be leaving us as of Friday. Is his last day. He's going to the DEC, so I just wanted to make you aware of that. He's going to be sorely missed.
You will be missed,
Definitely.
Kirk. You've done a great job since you've been with us. I know most of us I've spoken with about this, we really hate to see you go. But best to you and your family, and I know you'll stay at Keene, so that's probably the best thing. If we're going to lose you, we're just going to lose part of you. Thank you very much. Mr. Blades.
I'll offer to move a resolution of appreciation.
Do that. Second. Thank you. Anything else? Nobody else leaving? No further business, we stand adjourned.